Hey everyone, this is Mr. Lawyanker. I hope you can hear me all right. This will be our first experience this year with using YouTube videos and some other instructional materials to learn while I am absent. Unfortunately, I'm sick and unable to be in class today, so I've recorded some of these things ahead of time so that we can continue to move forward and not lose time within our week as we prepare for our test next class period. So today is all about the 13 colonies and the characteristics that they possess. All of them very different, some similarities throughout, but overall very different, diverse areas, even though they're all on the East Coast. And I mean, we well know that the United States is popular with its diversity, has a lot of different people from many areas, and that is true even for some of the 13 early colonies. So where we'll begin is the New England colonies. The New England colonies are going to consist of New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And these states, if any of you have ever been fortunate enough to travel up to the New England area, you might have found that in the wintertime it's extremely cold. The weather and the temperament up there is rather extreme. The climate can be very cold in the winter, and even in the summertime, it's still a cooler summer. And so, couple that with the fact that there's a lot of the soil up there is not very great. It's rocky and not very conducive for farming. And the New England colonies did not become an agricultural epicenter. Instead, they really started to develop an economy that was based on the things that they did well. And so if you have a lot of coastline, you have a lot of wooded areas that aren't great for farming, then what you begin to focus on as an economy is shipbuilding, fishing, and lumbering. That is going to be their hallmarks. That's going to be their keys that make them very rich and successful. And when it comes to the shipbuilding, fishing, and lumbering, the place that they're going to be trading with is going to be back to England. Of course, part of being a colony means that you can only trade with your mother empire, and so there is that limit on that. But these New England colonies, with all of these rich natural resources, they are going to be exporting these things back to New England. And over time, this relationship that often favors the English more than it does the American colonists is going to begin to rub some of the colonists the wrong way. When we get to the American Revolution, we're going to talk about how Boston, in particular, seems to be this epicenter of the American Revolution, where all of these big named events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party are always taking place. And it really stems from this resentment that colonists have built up inside of them over years of having their wealth being transferred back to England and essentially helping Europe feed into the Industrial Revolution. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're the backbone of that, and New England is certainly a big part of that. So economically, these natural resources are going to help England, but it's not going to be through farming. It's going to be through fishing, shipbuilding, and lumber. So important to note that there on your organizer. Socially, the New England colonies are also very unique as well. Much of their colonial society was based on religious standing, and the religious group that we're going to find in places like Massachusetts in particular are called the Puritans. Now, a lot of people mix up the Puritans and the Pilgrims. They think they are the same group. They are not. They are a little different. The Puritans were actually a group of individuals who were seeking freedom from religious persecution. They get their name because they did not agree with the Anglican church that was in England, and they wanted to purify the church, essentially. And so that's where they get their name from. And so they left the New World, or the Old World, for religious reasons, folks. That's much different than what Jamestown was started for. Jamestown was an economic motive. This is a religious motive, trying to create their own, what they would call a covenant community. And it was based on two things. It was based on their religious beliefs, and it was based on their idea that all men and women were created equal under God. So in 1629, the leader of the Puritans was called John Winthrop. He obtained a royal charter, and he lands in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and creates the city of Boston. And that's going to be the Puritan center. Today, it's still a very Puritan type of an area, religiously speaking. And this society that they're going to create is really interesting because they believed in what was called a unity of spirit. They believed in social equality, but much more because it was necessary for survival. Not necessarily that they believed this back in England, but once they showed up in the New World, they realized that the terrors and the reality of living in a place that has very little development requires everyone to work and everyone to put forth an equal effort. So they came up with what was called the Mayflower Compact. And this Mayflower Compact basically in a nutshell says, hey, listen, we are going to create a community where everyone is equal and everyone's going to have an equal say. And it stems from our religion, yes, but it also comes out of the necessity to survive. And so this is where we get in the New England colonies something that we call a direct democracy. Okay, if you see that word there, maybe highlight that. Direct democracy is very important to the Puritans because it's different than what we have today. In a direct democracy, everyone votes on every issue. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, isn't that what we do in America? Not quite. You want to be careful about that because here in our country, everyone does not vote on every issue. Instead, what we do is we elect representatives who are supposed to act and behave in our interest. For example, we elect representatives, we elect senators, we elect governors, city mayors, councilmen and women, school board members, whatever that might be, local, state, or national level. We elect people to hopefully make decisions that are in our best interest. Now, the reason we do that is because a representative democracy is much more manageable for a country that involves millions and millions of people. If you're in a small community like the Puritans, direct democracy is more feasible, as you don't have to count up quite as many votes. I mean, can you imagine if for every decision we had to make as a country, we had to incorporate 300 million or so voters that we have in our country? It would be a nightmare. We'd never get anything done. So the Puritans, what they're known for is this direct democracy. And the reality was, if you disagreed with the Puritans, you could easily be on the out. As time moved on, the Puritans grew very intolerant of other people. They despised anyone who challenged their religion and government and how these things were intertwined. In fact, the colony of Rhode Island that you see there on your map was created by dissenters. They were kicked out of the Puritan community, and that's how they created that state of Rhode Island. And so this direct democracy ideology, this model that we see, it doesn't originate in the New England colonies. Not where first time we ever see it. That would be Athens of Greece. But it is the first time in the New World that we see a much more direct form of democracy rather than the representative one that we're so accustomed to. Most of the New England most of the Puritans are going to do this through their town centers. You might want to circle that word as well. The town centers, the churches that the Puritans revolve around, are quite literally going to be the center of their life. They're going to build their church, and then they're going to build first, and then they'll build the rest of their towns around it. So figuratively and literally, it is the center of their life, and all of their major decisions, whether it's electing their priest of their town or electing their leader, is going to happen through a direct democratic model. So that's the New England colonies. Let's now move on to the middle colonies. And the middle colonies, of course, are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Now, the middle colonies are, in essence, a mixture of the southern characteristics and the New England characteristics. And that's for a couple of reasons. But when you think about whether it's economic or political or social, understand that the middle colonies are going to be kind of a mixture of all of them. So the way the middle colonies actually began, folks, is that they were settled by English, Dutch, and German-speaking immigrants. It was kind of a mixture. Some people, when immigrants came over, they realized they didn't want to land up near the Puritans, but they also couldn't land down near the Cavaliers in Virginia. And so they kind of settled somewhere in the middle. And over time, what happened here is that the English essentially moved down from the north and up from the south. And over time, they began to kind of squeeze these areas out. And the English defeated the Dutch and the Swedish and the German immigrants who were there. And in a really interesting twist here, which kind of comes to define the middle colonies, instead of kicking all of these people out, what the English did was they essentially allowed them to stay. But they had to do two things. They had to remain committed to the country of Britain, and they were, of course, going to have to pay taxes as any other colonist would. However, this idea did lead to a much more tolerant society, in that the idea that the middle colonies were a place that you could go for many different reasons, basically a safe haven. And so the middle colonies were a much more appealing place. Economically, they did well. The middle colonies like New York, New Jersey, PA, and Delaware, because of their not only large land, but ability to have also some coastline, they do kind of develop an economy that's based on a lot of things. Shipbuilding for one, but also some small-scale farming and trading. New York and Philadelphia became huge commercial centers as kind of a connecting point between the North and the South, and they become very wealthy. And Philadelphia, even as an entire city, became kind of a seat of government, not just for Pennsylvania, but that it was also a potential seat of government for the entire colonies as a representation of the American colonists. So these middle colonies were huge. They were massive. They were doing very well, and they were very wealthy. Now, Pennsylvania in particular actually got its name in 1667 from a young man named William Penn. Here you see on his left, he looks like the man on the Quaker Oats box, because that's essentially who he is. He was a Quaker, and he created the colony of Pennsylvania because the king, Charles II, actually owed his father a debt. And as repayment to the son, he gave him a huge tract of land in the New World that Penn later calls Pennsylvania. Penn for his father's name, and Sylvania, which means wooded area. So essentially Penn's wooded area. And William Penn, as a Quaker, the Quakers were very different than the Puritans. The Quakers were tolerant of all religious ideas. And so it attracted a lot of different people, and Pennsylvania became the area that if you were, cast out for your skin, for your religious beliefs, for whatever reason, you could go to Pennsylvania and you could find a home. So that is really the reputation of a lot of the middle colonies. Now, when it comes to politics, the middle colonies are also going to be a mixture of the South and the North, whereas the Puritans are direct democracy, everyone votes on every issue. The middle colonies, unfortunately, are going to have some restrictions on who can vote, and their restrictions are going to consist of men with property. So it's not going to be quite as democratic, as I would say, as the New England colonies are, but instead they're going to choose representatives, and the only people that can vote for that are men with property. Unfortunately, that's going to be an early theme in American history, are the restrictions on voting rights for both women and minorities. So that's your middle colonies. And then the southern colonies, let's quickly talk about those. The southern colonies, folks, let's first start at the Carolinas. We know the first southern colony to start was Virginia, and we talked about Jamestown and some of the Cavaliers that set up there. But the first Catholic settlements were actually created in 1634, about 30 years after Jamestown, when Lord Baltimore received kind of a grant to establish this Catholic getaway. And the Carolina colony, which later becomes North and South Carolina, was established as kind of a Carolina takeaway. Unfortunately, economically, the Carolinas did fairly well. South Carolina was used for rice and indigo, and these cash crops had a lot of value to them. Now, not quite as much as tobacco. Unfortunately, they didn't have the environment they needed to grow tobacco quite as well. But they still did make good money. And then North Carolina was kind of an interesting story, because if you look on our map here on the right, you see Virginia. If you were a Cavalier, you probably owned huge amounts of land in Virginia. But if you were a poorer farmer who didn't have maybe the virtue of a family status or family wealth, you probably went a little south in the North Carolina to try to find some land to make a living for yourself. So, North Carolina was much more of a haven for poor farmers that were fleeing either from Virginia mostly, or even from South Carolina. Now, in terms of Virginia, now moving on from the Carolinas, we know what Virginia was all about. Virginia in the lowlands area east of the Blue Ridge Mountains was all about plantations and large cash crops. Tobacco, rice, indigo, all of these things was what Virginia was creating, and they were doing extremely well. Please understand, folks, at this point, Virginia is number one in population. They are number one in economic output. They are number one in influence in just about every other category you can imagine. So this really was and a colony that dominates the early goings here. And because of that, because Virginia was settled by these Cavaliers that have a lot of money, a lot of the political structure that Virginia uses was also based on the old structure they got from New England. So their social structure was much more about family status and ownership of land. In fact, they are going to be the most conservative out of all of these areas, and they're definitely going to be the most restrictive when it comes to voting rights. But that's in the coastal lands. In the mountains and farther inland, like the Shenandoah Valley, you're going to see more small subsistence farmers, hunters, and traders, but you're not going to see quite the same large plantations like you would have seen in the lowlands. And then the final one is Georgia. The colony of Georgia is kind of an exception to the rule. It was actually started by a man named James Oglethorpe in 1732. And mostly Georgia, if you look on a map, Georgia was created as a buffer zone between South Carolina and the Spanish. The English wanted some land to make sure the Spanish could not move up into the colonies area. And so it was started as a very, very poor chance. It was created for debtors and paupers to kind of have a second chance. A pauper is maybe a prisoner or even a debtor himself. And so it was a very tough going at first for the colony of Georgia, but eventually that will get better. Politically speaking, the southern colonies, pay attention to this, they're going to maintain very strong ties to Britain. And so basically if you wanted to vote or you wanted to be in power in the Virginias, you had to have some sort of a family status or very, very, very wealthy. So very restrictive overall. Now, we talked about how in Virginia in particular, the name of those wealthy landowners are going to be Cavaliers. These were powerful planters that became very dominant and aristocratic and eventually began to really rule the entire colony. But the one thing these Cavaliers did do that's a positive and that was kind of democratic is that they did create what is called the Virginia House of Burgesses. This was a representative assembly where the first form of government really starts in the New World. Now, what's also neat about this House of Burgesses is that this is still the acting body of government in Virginia. It's now known as the Virginia General Assembly, and they've moved their headquarters to Richmond, Virginia. But it has been around essentially for 400 years, so you should look for that anniversary here coming up in a year or two. Final topic for today is indentured servitude, okay? When you talk about the southern colonies, unfortunately, you can't get away from the fact that a lot of this plantation labor necessitated cheap and or free labor. The growth of plantation-based agriculture requires labor. And originally, these labors were met by poor indentured servants, not slaves. What an indentured servant was, if you're reading this pamphlet here, is basically an indentured servant was someone who could not afford to get over to the New World. They couldn't afford the ship ticket, if you will. And so wealthy landowners would actually pay for their ticket to the New World. The indentured servant would have to work for 7 years to pay back the planter. But after that, they would get land, they would get some tools, and hopefully be able to start their lives after giving up 7 years of work. Now, there are some catches to this that are going to definitely help the landowner more than the indentured servant, but it was a way that some people got their start. But eventually, the landowners realized that although this cheap labor was a good way to go, the only thing better than cheap labor was free labor. And so eventually, most of the plantation labor came to be filled by the importation of Africans as slaves. And so during the 16, 17, and 1800s, well, I should say 15, 16, and 1700s, thousands and thousands of African slaves were brought to the Americas. And they were brought primarily by this route from Africa to the New World called the Middle Passage. It was a sick journey. Many people oftentimes died as they crammed people into the bottom of these boats, and disease was rampant. And unfortunately, this transgression is going to result later on in, the Civil War as America starts to understand how do we deal with these people who have been forcibly brought to the Americas, who deserve freedom, who deserve equality, and yet have been so intertwined with the early goings and kind of the formation of Southern culture. That's going to be very hard to get away from. So That was 20 minutes, folks. I hope you're still listening. Please make sure that you pay attention to the rest of what's on Schoology, and you complete the other assignments. The test on Thursday will take place as scheduled, even though I am not here today. So please let me know if you have any questions in the meantime. You have a few more things to do before you go for today. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.